Welcome everyone to the Unitarian Church of Los Alamos, whoever you are, wherever you are on your life's journey, whatever you believe and whomever you love, you're welcome here. My name is James Carroll. I'm the religious education instructor for adult religious education here at the Unitarian Church. And today we're going to continue our series on Islam by discussing sacred rites and sacred sites, Islamic ritual, and the Hajj. There is a webpage, cites.google.com/view comparative religion. It's not exactly up to date, but once you get there, you can find links to the YouTube channel where all the rest of the lectures are, and I will try to update this site soon. It does have links both to the YouTube video recordings of these lectures as well as handouts, additional resources, that sort of material. This is the third in a series on Islam. The previous lectures included an introduction to Islam and the life of Muhammad. To quickly review some of that material, Islam means submission or surrender, from the same root as peace, well-being, in Hebrew, salam, or Jerusalem, the city of peace. A Muslim then is one who surrenders. So we can think of Islam as the religion or the path of surrender. Stephen Prothero, I love this rubric for quickly getting at kind of the heart of a religious tradition, says that every religious tradition proposes that there's something wrong with the world, a problem, a solution, a technique for achieving that solution, and exemplars that you can follow along that path. So, for example, for Christianity, the problem is sin, the solution is salvation, the technique is faith in Jesus Christ and his sacrifice, or potentially works, depending on which Christian tradition you belong to, and the exemplars are Christ, the saints, the prophets, etc. Similarly, you can do the same thing for Hinduism, Buddhism, and it allows you to quickly see some of the distinctive differences between Hinduism, for example, and Buddhism. Hinduism, the problem is samsara, the same as Buddhism, but the solution in Hinduism is moksha, liberation, enlightenment in Buddhism. But the difference is subtle in that Buddhism, the problem is suffering. Samsara is only part of it, that the suffering doesn't end. But the problem there is suffering, and the solution then is the Noble Eightfold Path, etc. When we do the same sort of thing for Islam, we get a hint of the core concept. The problem with this world is pride, mankind setting themselves up as if they were deity, or worshiping the works of their own hands, often pride as embodied in idolatry. And therefore the solution is to submit to God, thus the ritual prayers that involve bowing towards the home of God. You're submitting to God physically, bowing towards him. The techniques for achieving it are the 5 pillars, and the exemplars especially are Muhammad. Muhammad is seen as the ideal human life, the example that we should follow. The 5 pillars then are the declaration of faith, there is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet. The ritual prayer, almsgiving, fasting, the Hajj, pilgrimage, and jihad. Today we're going to talk especially about the prayer and the Hajj. Jihad is listed sometimes as a 6th pillar. It involves struggle, the internal struggle to submit. So you can think of Islam as the struggle. Normally we struggle to actualize ourselves or to produce our will, but in this case it's the struggle to submit our will to something higher than us. Also jihad is sometimes used we call that the greater jihad. The lesser jihad is then the struggle with the external forces that may be trying to stop us, or to stop Islam, for example. Yes?
So since you've put up the view graph comparing all the religions, what is it that makes Christianity the most bureaucratized and multi-level structure of all? When I look at the underlying spiritual aspects, I don't see the difference. But only Christianity has built up this multi-tiered management system.
So the question for those who couldn't hear is, what made Christianity so bureaucratized relative to the others? I don't know if it's true that none of the others have that. For example, let me think. Confucianism certainly has that, even to a greater extent. You can also see it in Shia Islam. They had a hierarchy with the imams at the top who were authoritative. I suspect it has to do more with the history and the original founders and the bureaucracies that they set up or didn't set up at the beginning of founding of the religion, more than just a theological issue. If salvation through sin comes through faith, that could be a personal thing. You don't need any bureaucracy, right? Which was the point of the Protestant Reformation, one of the points. But there are also Christian traditions that imply that you have to solemnify that through certain ritual acts that require a priesthood. Remember, Christianity grew out of Judaism, where there was a formal priesthood in the Jerusalem temple as well, which I think caused them to create their own priesthood. But I don't actually know the answer to your question. I think that would be an interesting research topic. So that was our introduction to Islam. The other second class was the life of Muhammad. We talked about his birth, the fact that he was an orphan, the fact that he was adopted by his uncle, and then we talked about his first revelation in the cave in Mecca, where he said that Gabriel came to him and told him to recite the words of God, and the words of the Quran came. We talked about how he fled to Medina. There he raised an army and raided some caravans and started a conflict between them and Mecca. We talked about the details of the conflict between Medina and Mecca that ended with Muhammad capturing or entering Mecca and opening the Kaaba, the temple there at Mecca, as a site of pilgrimage for Muslims. And then he died of a fever shortly thereafter in the arms of his youngest wife. We talked about some of the controversial aspects, including the warfare and also his polygamy. So we didn't shy away from those controversial aspects, but we didn't make them the center of the story. So today, we want to talk about sacred rites, sacred spaces, ritual, and the Hajj. So the Hajj is one of the 5 pillars, but now I want to share the details of the rituals involved in this. I had a third aspect here, which was included things like the Taj Mahal and some of these other very, very beautiful Islamic architectural structures, and I'm going to have to cut those for time. In fact, we're going to end up looking at the amount of material I got. We'll probably go a little over today. If you have to leave early, I will understand. But there's a lot of material here. So let's start with mosques. The word mosque means a place of prostration. These are very similar to a Jewish not a temple, but a synagogue, in that it's a place you go to worship and pray kind of on a weekly basis. But the mosque has several ritual aspects, including a basin for washing, because as you enter the mosque, you need to be if you're trying to approach God in prayer, etc., you need to be in a state of purity, cleanliness, ethical purity especially, but that is symbolized by physical purity, and so there's usually a basin where you can wash your hands and feet before entering at most mosques. There's a mihrab, which is a niche that points towards the Kaaba in Mecca. Jews have something similar, but usually it will point towards Jerusalem. Muhammad was, of course, aware of Jewish tradition, and so in early Islamic times, they also prayed towards Jerusalem, and then later he changed that to Mecca. And so they have this niche, so you know which direction to face when you pray as you face Mecca. It also produces a really good place for the leader to stand and lead the prayers and sometimes to give a sermon. Most mosques also have a minaret, especially in the days before amplification. The person could climb to the top of the minaret and perform the call to prayer, which is this repetitive call that tells people when it is time to come pray. You remember last time there was a story about why Muslims pray 5 times a day. Jews pray 3 times a day. Muslims got to do better, so we can pray 5 times a day. And how Muhammad, originally God wanted them to do 50, and then he talks to Moses, and Moses convinces him to barter it down because the people will never succeed. And he goes back and barters with God until he gets the number down to 5. So 5 times a day, someone would, especially in the old days, would climb the minaret and issue the call to prayer from the top so that most people could hear and know that it was time to pray. Today, they often have loudspeakers at the top that will ring out over entire cities. The prayer itself is an illustration of this concept of submission as you move through various acts of bowing. These are the sorts of things people do when they enter the presence of a monarch or king to show their submission to the monarch. And so what we're doing here is showing your submission to God by bowing to God and facing Mecca specifically because that is God's house. So you bow to God by facing God's house, God inside the said house, and illustrating physically your submission to God while reciting specific prayers. This is the call to prayer. And when I was in Israel in a study abroad, we had a Hebrew teacher and an Arabic teacher. And we also had a Jewish historian, an Arabic historian, who each told us the history of Israel from their own perspective. That was one of the most eye-opening events in my life because it felt like they were living in completely different realities. The history they told was entirely different from very different perspectives. But the Arabic teacher, one of the things he taught us was the call to prayer. And there were some people down, he actually taught us to sing it, not that I can remember exactly the tune, but there were people down off the hill who were Muslims who thought that it was problematic that they could hear these Christians up on the hill saying the call to prayer. They thought they were maybe mocking them, so they came up to ask what was going on, and they met our Arabic teacher and found out that he was trying to teach them about Arabic tradition and specifically Arabic religion by teaching them to recite and sing the call to prayer. And he had a very different experience according to the story we heard, and he left feeling gratified that these people were interested in learning their culture. So this is the call to prayer. It's Allahu Akbar, repeated twice. God is great. Ashhadu anna la illallah. This is, I did that wrong. Ashhadu anna la ilaha illa Allah, which is, I witness that there is no God but God, repeated twice. Ashhadu anna ish Muhammadan Rasulallah. I witness that Muhammad is the prophet of God. Hayat Allah al-Salat. Hasten to prayer. Repeated. Hayat Allah al-Falah. Hasten to success. Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar. God is great. God is great. And then you end with La ilaha illa Allah. There is no God but God. So again, it's this emphasis of monotheism over polytheism and submission. You can see all those aspects in the prayer, in the call itself. Those are, the mosque is the sort of thing that you would find in any location. There are mosques everywhere, and they have some of those same elements that we just described. The washing basin, the minaret, and the niche for facing Mecca, where the call to prayer is offered and the submission is given. Islam also has three what sometimes colloquially called the three holiest sites in Islam. And so I want to show you pictures of all three of them and discuss their significance. And then ending, of course, with the most sacred site in Mecca and the rituals performed there at the Hajj. That's the one place where you get some additional ritual that you don't see in the other mosques. The first, of course, is the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, the Al-Masjid, an-Nabawi Mosque in Medina. And by the way, I apologize for my horrendous Arabic pronunciation. I took a semester of Arabic. That doesn't mean I can remember how to pronounce these things. Masjid al-Haram in Mecca, which is where the Kaaba is. So the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. This is the only one on my list that I've actually been to. I've been inside, which is rare. It's a place of prayer, so they don't allow tourists in very often. But during a time when it was closed, the director of the Jerusalem Center, or maybe it was our Arabic teacher, who knew the individual in charge of the mosque, and he specifically took us there and gave us a tour, kind of by ourselves. It was incredibly impressive, and not something that everyone gets to do. And I feel very honored to have been there. I have a few pictures that I took. I'm not using those here, but no, sorry, I apologize. In this location, I wasn't allowed to take pictures, so this is why I'm using the pictures of others in this location. What makes a place sacred, more sacred than another? Usually it's some event happened there that you want to memorialize. You want to remember something that happened. And in this case, this is the night journey of Muhammad, which we talked about in his life. But the short version is one day while he was in Medina, I believe, he had a dream or a vision where he was taken with by a horse who traveled from Medina, all the way to, maybe it was Mecca. I'm trying to remember if it was before he left for Medina or not. I knew this last week, or last month when I taught this class, and now I've forgotten exactly the timing. But he traveled from there to Jerusalem, and then in Jerusalem he met all the different prophets, and then he was taken up into heaven and had this heavenly journey. Very, very akin to what we see in Jacob's ladder, which happened at Bethel, right, the house of God. And of course, therefore, it's not surprising to me that Muhammad has this night journey in Jerusalem at the site of the temple. Of course, the dream says he went to the furthest mosque, which was interpreted as the mosque in Jerusalem, which of course there was no mosque in Jerusalem yet. But this was the place where the temple had once stood, is the general interpretation. These sorts of journeys into heaven and back show up all over the place in religions from all over the world. We see it in Isaiah chapter 6 in Judaism. Dante's Divine Comedy is another great example. And if you want to go all the way back to Mesopotamian tradition, there's a beautiful example of this in Ishtar's descent to the netherworld, where as she descends down to the world where the dead reside, in this case she's descending down, she has to remove various aspects of her clothing. And the idea here is stripping yourself of all earthly connections. And then as she comes back, she's reinvested with divine sacred clothing, placing sacred clothing upon her body until she reaches back up to the world and returns to the world. So these sorts of journeys into the afterlife are common elements of religious tradition around the world. And I'm going to admit my bias here as a historian. It looks to me like they're borrowing from each other, and that there's a common tradition here that they are all plugged into from that cultural context and borrowing from. Like I said, this is the one place we actually went. This is my class in front of the Dome of the Rock. We were allowed to take pictures outside. I had this conversation with several Jewish people, and I got different answers from them. But there's some debate about how far onto the Temple Mount a Jewish person would be willing to, an Orthodox Jewish person would be willing to stray. But it's interesting that this was originally a Jewish site, and now it's an Islamic site, and most practicing Jews won't go there. This is an aerial view, which has the advantage you can see. This is the actual Al-Aqsa Mosque. But when we think about Islamic sacred sites on the Temple Mount, we often think of the Dome of the Rock. These two buildings are set next to each other, across from each other, facing each other, and they each have slightly different significance. This is a place where Muslims go to pray. This is a place of pilgrimage that they will often go to. And this is seen as the site where Abraham was told to offer Ishmael instead of Isaac. It's Ishmael as a sacrifice. And this is the place where Muhammad ascended up into heaven. And in both locations, there are these sacred buildings that they have constructed. And the Al-Aqsa Mosque is generally, sorry, not the Al-Aqsa Mosque. I'm sorry. There's a name for the entire complex, and there's a name for the mosque and the dome separately, but I didn't write that down apparently. We believe this is the central site for the Temple of Solomon. We know that the retaining wall around it, this is a picture of the retaining wall, is the right place. It has these massive foundation stones which were placed by Herod the Great. And then you can see another layer on top, which has some medieval architecture added on top afterwards. So this is the right mount. And then the question is, where did the temple sit? This is right in the middle, and that's where the Dome of the Rock sits, and underneath the Dome of the Rock is the foundation stone. We believe the temple was built on a mountain at a certain place in Jerusalem, and then this retaining wall was built up around it. And so if that's correct, then you have this kind of backfill under the retaining wall with the peak of the mountain poking up at the middle, and that would be, of course, where the rock of the Dome of the Rock is the foundation stone, and therefore probably the top of the mountain, and therefore probably the location of the Holy of Holies in the Jerusalem temple.
So is the Wailing Wall somewhere around there?
Yes. If I had a north, south, east, west, the Wailing Wall is on the western edge. I believe it's right here. Yeah. So north is this way, and this is west. And so this is where Jewish people will come and face that wall that Herod built and offer their prayers. Because, of course, in Jewish tradition, you have to have certain ritual cleansing before you approach the temple, and then you're not supposed to enter the Holy of Holies, and they don't know exactly where the Holy of Holies is, so they won't go up there. So therefore, they worship down here at the wall next to the temple, and that's a place where it's called the Wailing Wall because you can express your sadness. The temple's gone, but also because there's that line, worship the Lord your God with all your heart, might, mind, and strength. And so, very Orthodox people will do this thing. They're trying to put their entire body into their worship at the wall as they worship. But yes, so that's definitely connected. But that wall goes around. There's other places to approach the wall. You can approach the wall, apart from the western wall. And again, the original stones are there. This part here is called the City of David, possibly a misnomer, but this is certainly an area of rich archaeological excavations where Iron Age elements of the city of Jerusalem sat. So the city of Jerusalem, the old city of Jerusalem sat here in the low levels, and then there was a mountain that came up to the top this way, and then at the top of the mountain would have been the Temple of Solomon, and then later this very large retaining wall would have been built. This is the mosque at the top. This mosque is used basically like every other mosque in Islam. There's nothing terribly unique about it except for its historical connotation. It's a place Muhammad ascended to heaven. And it's important because this is how every sacred site gains its sacredity, right? It has some connection to some historical event. I should have mentioned Umar. Umar was one of the companions of Muhammad, one of the first caliphs of the empire he created, and he conquered Jerusalem. It was a fairly bloodless thing. It was kind of basically turned over to him. And when he entered the city, he says, "Hey, I know Jewish people. I know where you face Jerusalem when you pray. When you're outside of Jerusalem, where do you face when you're inside Jerusalem?" And they pointed up at the Temple Mount. They said, "We pray that way because that's where the temple was." And then Omar went up there, and there was a garbage heap. And what had happened is the Byzantines had very antithetical views of Jews. And of course, Jesus himself had cursed the temple. And so they dumped their garbage there as a way of degrading the Jewish people. Which is strange because, yes, Jesus cursed the temple, but he also said he was going to be rebuilt in the last days and all sorts of... It doesn't quite make sense to me, but whatever. That's a different form of Christianity that way of thinking about the Jewish people doesn't make sense to me from the New Testament as I read it, but whatever. And so there was a garbage dump there, and he started cleaning it up. And a bunch of people came from the city and helped him. And the story goes he was in there with his own hands cleaning up the garbage. And then they constructed these marvelous structures in the location, which has now created a great deal of contention because you have these fundamentalist Christians who believe this building has to be destroyed so that the second coming can happen because the temple has to be rebuilt. And you get these Jewish people who really want to rebuild their temple, and this Muslim shrine is in the middle of our holy site. So we've got to, and you every once in a while you get a wacko who walks up there with a bomb strapped to his back trying to blow up the building so that they can fulfill prophecy and rebuild the temple or whatever it is, whether they're Jewish or Christian. And so it's created all sorts of contention, as you can imagine. This is a picture from inside. Like I said, I wasn't allowed to take pictures inside, but it's a very beautiful building, very statuesque marble pillars. This is the Dome of the Rock, the outside of it. Again, you're not allowed to have kind of depictions of physical things, right? If there's an anti-image sense in Islam. And so they came up with just very beautiful other forms of architecture, from Arabic calligraphy up here. And a lot of the verses in the Quran that are quoted on the Dome of the Rock are things like, God has no son, trying to remind the Christians that Jesus isn't the Son of God. God has no son. There's only God. But just this beautiful tile work is just incredible, and the beautiful calligraphy is incredibly impressive. This is, I think, one of the most beautifully decorated buildings I've ever seen. Oops, I'm going the wrong direction. This is what it looks like on the walls inside. This is the entrance. And once you get there, there is this foundation stone rock. I've seen all sorts of evangelical Christians trying to point at aspects in the rock and find the dimensions and say, well, here you can see the pillars for the Holy of Holies. But in any event, the tradition is that the Holy of Holies sits there. It's probably true. But weirdly enough, there's a cave underneath it, which is just this very interesting side note. You go under, you can head down some stairs. I think the stairs are over here, but I can't remember. But you head down some stairs, and there's this very fascinating cave underneath the Dome of the Rock. Who knows what that was, how old that is, what that was for, whether it was dug later, if there actually always was a cave right under the Holy of Holies. If so, what were the Jewish people using it for? Not a clue. But there's all sorts of very fascinating and wild and probably non-accurate internet speculation that you'll wander into if you actually search for this material. But the cave does exist, and you can go there. Muslims sometimes will use it as a place of prayer. The other very sacred site is in Medina, where Muhammad died, Al-Masjid an-Nabawi. I have not been here. It was constructed in, I believe there was a small shrine constructed much earlier, but this building was constructed in 1278, rebuilt in 1280, and then rebuilt several times in the 5th century, and then finally rebuilt again in 1879, and then the dome was painted green. I don't remember the date for that. And so now it's sometimes called the Green Dome. The dome itself sits over the mausoleum of Muhammad, Abu Bakr, and Umar, 3 of the founders of Islam, 2 of the early caliphates. This is the interior, and again, the same sort of architecture, these marble pillars with these gold caps. And this is the mausoleum. It's not clear, if there's an actual tomb, but this is the mausoleum for sure of Muhammad, Abu Bakr, and Umar. All right, so that's what usually considered the second most sacred spot. Again, it's a place of pilgrimage because many Muslims will go there right after or right before their Hajj pilgrimage. But the Hajj itself, but it's mostly just a mosque, right? The rituals there are just the rituals you would expect at a mosque. The Hajj, however, has its own unique rituals, and it's the one that's different from the others. This is Masjid al-Haram, is the mosque, basically, in this entire complex. And then the Kaaba is that central square box that you're used to seeing. So what we know from Islamic sources is that this functioned as a pagan temple before Muhammad cleansed it of its pagan influences and restored its monotheistic origin according to Islamic tradition. But according to, we don't have the primary sources from the other side, but according to Islamic sources, a deity was worshipped there called Allah, which means the God. But again, according to Islamic sources, there were many idols also there. Whether there was an idol to Allah is unclear, but there were many other idols there. So we don't know very much about pre-Islamic traditions, except it was fragmented, and there were many small city-states. What we see in other traditions is that you would conquer a place, and then you would take their idol from their Holy of Holies, and you would bring it to your temple, and you would put it in the courtyard. So if you go back to this, courtyard, didn't look like this back then, but you would put the idols here and face your Holy of Holies. And the idea was You've now shown that these deities are subjected to yours. In other words, this is a form of henotheism, right? We believe in many gods, but we worship one God, or one God is superior to the other deities, and we illustrate the superiority of our God over your gods by having their idols all face each other. There could even be an aspect of, remember, because I have a bias of I believe religion evolves from earlier sources. I have a lecture that I recommend on the history of how monotheism evolves out of polytheism in Judaism. This almost looks like one of the steps along that very path, going the wrong direction. What Muhammad claims about it is what we call restorationist theology. Right. This is the idea. For example, Joseph Smith, the American prophet, he created a temple ritual that was similar to Freemasonry, but he claimed that he was restoring the true temple ritual, and Freemasonry was a corrupt version of the original ritual that he is restoring. Muhammad is making the same claim. Again, my bias, however, is that these things evolve from earlier sources through human interaction. Again, here's an example of an Israelite temple to Yahweh with two stones representing Yahweh and his consort, probably Asherah, and two altars for burning incense in front of those two stones. So again, we don't know exactly how the idols in the Kaaba were being used and were being oriented, but we know that they existed, and that one of the deities, we believe, again from Islamic tradition, was, because one of the deities was named Allah, there seems to be this concept of the God and then the other gods, and this one God being somehow either proto-monotheistic or henotheistic. If we want to know what the Kaaba looked like before Muhammad cleansed it, it's hard because we don't know what elements he kept and claimed a restorationist theology around, and which elements were there that he purged, because they're gone, and we don't have them. We have some descriptions, but they're hard to follow. But we do have a couple temples from Arabia that we can compare it to, including this one at Bahrain Temple in Yemen. This is the floor plan, we believe, and it's got a square Holy of Holies with a courtyard around it and a frontal courtyard where sacrifice was offered. This floor plan has a lot in common with the modern Mecca. This is the Kaaba, this is that place of circumambulation, and then out front there's a place where you offer sacrifice. And we'll see this same sort of thing in the details of the rituals of the Hajj as I go through them. Usually there's also a basin of water for washing out here, the same sort of thing we would see in a mosque. So basin of water, altar of sacrifice, some sort of outer courtyard, an inner courtyard where you can circumambulate, meaning to go around. Fancy, because we can't just say go around, right? We're scholars, we've got to make up some fancy word. And then a square Holy of Holies in the back. Interestingly enough, it has some similarity to Jerusalem temples, which had a square Holy of Holies in the back, and even some Syrian shrines. This is the Al-Dara temple in Syria. However, again, you're missing kind of the inner circumambulation around the Holy of Holies. And instead you have a courtyard around the entire temple. So, interestingly enough, it's almost like the Kaaba looks more like this, which isn't surprising. It looks more like an Arabian temple than it does an Israelite temple, but they all have very similar architectural artifacts. This is a drawing of what it may have looked like in earlier days before it was expanded. So sacrifice would have been offered, out to this, off the edge out here, and then you have this structure here. Interestingly enough, it is oriented to the four corners, the north, south, east, and west, just like the Israelite temple, except the corners of the building are oriented to the four corners instead of the faces of the building, like you would see in Israel. One of the things I believe, again, this is my assumption, one of the reasons that the people of Mecca didn't like the teachings of Muhammad was because he was telling them that their home was a pilgrimage site already. Should have mentioned this in pre-Arabian times. Their home was a pilgrimage site. It was also on the route, the trade route, and there was a well there. And you put those things together, it gave them great potential for wealth. They would protect the caravans. You could hire them out as protectors. They would stop there to get water, and they would have a sacred pilgrimage site. And this brought in a lot of money into Mecca, which had very few resources otherwise. I think one of the oppositions to Muhammad was he said, there are these idols. This is bad. We've got to stop the idols. And they thought if we end idol worship, we lose our source of income. And the irony of that is spelled out by this picture. Because through his restorationist theology, he turned this shrine into a monotheistic shrine that now millions of people visit every year, and it has brought enormous wealth to the people of, to the Prince of Saudi Arabia. But anyway, it's brought enormous wealth to the land, and the pilgrimage now is a bigger thing than it ever was. Just the sea of humanity. And you're supposed to circumambulate and touch the stone 7 times. There's no way everybody can touch the stone. In fact, now they let you circumambulate out in the courtyard because it's just too many people. And they have to keep rebuilding this thing and making it bigger so they can accommodate more and more pilgrims. This is the Kaaba itself in the center. This would then equate sort of to the Holy of Holies of this original shrine. And in its corner right here is a black stone, which we'll talk about in detail later. And there's also these golden doors. This is the kind of the list of some of the elements. There's a marker here to mark when you pass through, so you can count 7 times every time you pass that marker. Here's where the stone is. Here's the door. And there's other elements, including places where there used to be a well in this area. We'll talk about that in detail. But this is the floor plan inside. Last time I did this, I couldn't find pictures of the inside. I have them now. This is the door. Very beautiful kind of golden door. Most Muslims never get to go inside. The Hajj doesn't require you to go inside, just like the high priest only goes in the Holy of Holies every once in a while. The average Muslim circumambulates this shrine but does not go inside. But it is entered a couple times a year, I believe, to be cleaned, and they will anoint the walls with oil. This is something you also see in the Bible during the dedication of Solomon's temple, is that anointing with oil. This is our black stone. Yeah.
How big is that door?
That picture may help. He asked how big the door was. The whole thing is massive and cuboid, again, like the Holy of Holies in the Temple of Solomon. Here's our black stone. There's some debate about whether this was a meteorite. It was normally thought to have been a meteorite. Later analysis said it doesn't look like the type of stone that would make for a meteorite, but it's really hard to get samples, and meteorites come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. The reason to think it's a meteorite is meteorite stones are often venerated throughout the area. When a stone falls from heaven and someone notices that it fell from heaven, this is some sort of something sent by the gods, so you venerate it. The stone existed, we know, in the pre-Islamic times. So the stone was part of the veneration. One of the reasons this place was a sacred site is it had the black stone, which tradition says was white but turned black from the sins of the people. So they had the black stone, and they had this sacred well of Zamzam, and were on the trade route. Muhammad, as part of his restorationist theology, tells us that the stone was placed there by Abraham, and as he reworks the theology of this ritual. And again, the idea is original idea was to circumambulate the Kaaba 7 times and to touch the stone on each time. Now there's too many people, you can't, so you point at it each time you pass. And if you get to touch it, you're very, very lucky. And of course, this creates the danger of crushes, which have happened several times because you have people kind of competing to be able to touch it when everyone else around them sort of can't. And so they've put a lot of work into crowd control to try to prevent those sorts of tragedies that have happened in the past. But you can imagine that the challenge that poses, given how many Muslims there now are. I guess I should have pointed out, we talked about this in the 5 pillars in the last class. I should have just made it very clear. Going on the Hajj, this trip to Mecca once in your life if you can, is one of the 5 pillars, is an obligation for every Muslim who can do it. There's this concept of intent and also doing it if you can. If you can't do it, you're exempt, but Every Muslim is supposed to do this, which gives you an idea of how many people have to come to this place and how big that pilgrimage is. Yeah.
What happened during the COVID season?
What happened during COVID? I have no idea. I presume they held the Hajj anyway. Does anyone else know?
During the COVID season, it was shut down. It was closed. The only person allowed was the imam would be like a priest. He would go in and call for prayer, but that was closed. And I think the population for people was also like very limited, so it was closed.
I didn't know they closed it during COVID. That surprises me, but that makes me feel good.
Yes, because my mother was planning to go for Hajj. I am Muslim.
Okay, welcome.
Thank you. So she was planning to go, but then it happened to be closed that time, so she could not. And it is also mentioned everywhere the Hajj is only it's compulsory for the people who can perform because it is expensive.
I can imagine.
To Saudi Arabia and everything. So that is the reason when mentioning the fifth pillar of Islam, we also must mention that it's compulsory for the people who can, but not for the one who cannot go or they don't have resources to go.
Thank you for coming, by the way. And if I say anything that you disagree with and it's incorrect, feel free to speak up. I will also mention that when I did a series on Mormonism, at the end of this series, we invited a member of their church, one of the bishops from across the street, to come speak to us, and he got a chance to listen to everything I had said, and then stand up and say, well, this is my perspective on what we did. So our goal here is not to criticize, but to understand. Although as a historian, I also have this kind of desire to understand historically. And so sometimes my historical perspective is different from that of a believer, but I'm not trying to push, convince people not to believe. So we should talk after if you want to do it, or if you know someone who would be willing to come and do the same thing for Islam that we did for Mormonism. I would be happy to invite a believer to come and speak to us at the end of the series. And again, they can listen to everything I've said and correct anything I said wrong and that they disagree with and that sort of thing, because our primary goal seems to be ecumenical in the sense of creating a dialogue between believers and non-believers and a position of mutual understanding. That makes sense.
I work here, so I'm here every Sunday. I am a nursery coordinator here.
Okay.
So I'm here every Sunday. So yes, if anybody have, I think I came one time previously before started working here. I talked about Ramadan, the difference of Ramadan and Lent. So
Beautiful. Thank you. So like I said, let's talk after if you know someone who wants to give the last lecture series on Islam from the believer's perspective. I would love to have someone come. If there's a local mosque that has a leader who'd like to come speak to us, or if you want to do it. So here's a line. I believe this is from a modern Islamic scholar describing what he thinks about the stone. The Prophet has named the black stone the right hand of God, Yamin Allah. And by the way, if you've ever been to Israel, there's a place called Yad Vashem, which is the memorial for the Holocaust. And Yad, same thing. It comes from this idea of the hand, the right hand. In fact, the purpose there, one poses there one's hand to conclude the pact. Yad Vashem, these stone memorials that Jews set up in ancient times, they would create these stone monuments, which they called the Yad Vashem, the name and the hand. And those things would memorialize sacred events, including just to remember the people who died in the Holocaust. And so there's this concept of shaking. When you make a covenant, you shake somebody's hand. And so in this sense, touching the stone then is a symbolic act of reaching out, touching God's hand, and sealing the pact with deity. Very similar to what we see in Judaism, I think, if I understand this right. And God obtains there our pact of allegiance and submission. It's Islam, to submit. In the Quranic terminology, God is king, and in his realm there is a metropolis. And in the metropolis, naturally, a place, the home of God. If a subject wants to testify to his loyalty, he has to go to the royal palace and conclude personally the pact of allegiance. The right hand of the invisible God must be visible symbolically for them to make this pact, and thus the black stone in the Kaaba. So you see how this has been interpreted, and also why it became one of the pillars of Islam. Because you have to submit to God, and this is entering into that pact with God, or what we would call in Judaism covenant with God, is part of one of the culminating aspects of your submission, therefore one of the pillars of Islam. Here is a model of the interior. These are those doors. These are the doors that you were seeing from the outside. There's also a golden door here which heads to a stairwell which lets people on top of the roof for maintenance. And this is a photograph. Incredibly beautiful marble. This is that golden door to the roof access. And again, the reason it's not cuboid in the center is you have to have this roof access just for maintenance, etc. 3 very beautifully fashioned wooden pillars. There is an altar now in the middle. The altar was, I believe, a later addition, and it's where they'll place the oil and stuff when they're anointing the Kaaba with the sweet smelling oils during its maintenance periods. Very beautifully carved pillars and then gilded. The lamps were gifts from various. I think they would have been, before the age of electric lights. This would have been functional. This is how you light the interior when you go inside. You need some sort of a lamp. They also, I believe, some of them are incense altars, and some of them are incense burners. And some of them are lamps. I believe. I've seen conflicting answers when I tried to figure that out online. But some of them were given by very famous Islamic rulers, and there's a lot of history behind them. Some of them are very old. And there was a spot marked on the ground where Muhammad supposedly prayed after he came back and opened, the opening of the Kaaba was that moment when he came back and reconquered Mecca. And there's this spot where Muhammad supposedly offered prayer inside the Kaaba, marked on the floor. Again, beautiful pictures. The roof is very incredibly well decorated. And this is what happens when you both. Whenever you deal with another religion, you should leave room for what we call sacred envy, holy envy. And if you connect beauty to goodness, right? What makes something good and what makes something evil? Well, it's ethically beautiful and physically beautiful. So you connect beauty to goodness, and then you have no icons of physical, people, or in Judaism and Christianity. Or Christianity at least, the physical form of the human, because Christ came down as a man, so the physical form of humanity became an aspect of deity, and so you get the David and Michelangelo's Moses, and these beautiful Renaissance paintings. In Islam, you get just these beautiful geometric patterns that are just absolutely beautiful, stunningly beautiful. All right. This is the part I struggle the most with, and that's what do you do at this location? The rituals are confusing to me, and their order is confusing to me, and I did my best to make sense of this, and I'm going to try to explain it in the best way that I can, and I apologize if I get any of this wrong. The ritual takes place on the 1st to the 13th of the 12th or last month in the Islamic calendar. That moves around because they have a lunar calendar rather than a solar calendar, so it'll move around on our calendar. The first 7 days are called the Umrah, which is basically you're allowed to go on a pilgrimage to Mecca anytime you want, but when you do, it doesn't count as the Hajj unless you go on these certain days. And so the Umrah is a non-Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca. And so you start your Hajj with a non-Hajj pilgrimage, where you go in, you do the Tawaf, which is the circumambulation, and you do the Sa'i, which is the running between the two mountains. I'll show these in detail. And then you drink the water of the sacred well of Zamzam. Then you start the Hajj for real. You put on the Ihram garments, which are these white garments. I'll show you those in a minute. You pray at Mina. Then on the 9th, you travel to Arafat, and you stand before God, which is a time when people stand and listen to a sermon, and there's a meditation element. Then you travel to Muzdalifah, where you gather your pebbles for the stoning of Satan, which happens later, and you spend the night out under the stars. You sleep outside on a mat or something. Then you travel to Medina and you stone the devil. You offer sacrifice. Jews no longer offer sacrifice because the temple has been destroyed. Christians no longer offer sacrifice because Christ is the great last sacrifice. Muslims still offer sacrifice. So this is one of the few places you can go and find animal sacrifice still being practiced. Then you trim your hair and you do the tawaf, which is the circumambulation of the Kaaba, and you do the saya, which is the running between the two mountains. Then you go back and you stone the devil again, and then you do a farewell tawaf. These are the imam garments. It's a white robe over the left shoulder, tied on the right side, and another white wrap around the middle. So there's a one wrap over the shoulder, another wrap over the middle. And then you first do that, then you go through these various steps. The animal sacrifice, again, this is one of those places where you can go and see animal sacrifice still being offered. Used to be you'd offer your own animal sacrifice, and a third of the meat would go to you, a third of the meat would go to the poor, and a third to your family. I believe often now, because there's so many people there, they will often get a token that says they have paid someone else to offer the sacrifice on this day, mostly just because there's too many people. You can't all do it. And that meat is 100% given to the poor. So you have purchased an animal who will then be sacrificed on your behalf on the 10th day, and the meat will be given to the poor. So it's another way of feeding the poor. Notice there is no sort of meat to the priest like you would have in a Israelite temple. The tawaf is counterclockwise, which always fascinated me, because in the ancient Near East, you travel clockwise, which is the way the stars move through the sky, if you're in the northern hemisphere. And so almost every circumambulation ritual in the ancient Near East is clockwise. And the Muslims circumambulate counterclockwise. And I don't know if that's because the original temple was clockwise and he changed it because following the path of the stars was associated with paganism. And so maybe Muhammad reversed the direction. Or if it was always counterclockwise. I just don't know, but it's fascinating to me. And it matters in the sense that you would often circumambulate something clockwise if you wanted to bless it, and you would circumambulate counterclockwise if you wanted to curse it. So the idea would be when the Israelites circled Jericho 7 times and then blew their horns and the walls came tumbling down, they would have circumambulated counterclockwise to curse the walls, so the walls would fall down. This is a very common ancient Near Eastern ritual, and yet in Islam it's reversed. The sa'i is this running between the two mountains. Again, we don't know if running between the two mountains was part of the original ritual, or if it's something Muhammad added, or if it's something he simply reinterpreted. But the interpretation of the two mountains is this concept that, do you remember, in the Bible, Abraham sends Hagar away, and Hagar takes Ishmael with her. And that happens in Islamic tradition as well. And she went to these two mountains and ran back and forth looking for water and couldn't find water. And then eventually she lay down with her son to die of thirst. And he kicked the ground, and the Zamzam well, the sacred well, burst forth in water. And there's a very similar biblical story about them. And so they will run between the two mountains. They'll circle the Kaaba 7 times and run between the two mountains 7 times. And all of them have now been, notice the reinterpretation. You circle the Kaaba because the Kaaba is God's house, and you're showing your oneness with God and your connection to God. You run between the two mountains to remember Hagar and your need for God. Again, Islam, to surrender. You need God, you're lost without him, and you're dying of thirst, and God brings you water from the sacred well of Zamzam, which you then drink. This used to be done between two mountains out in the sky. It is right next to the modern mosque has expanded to the point where it almost touches the two mountain peaks that you're supposed to walk between. And so the entire thing has been covered as part of the mosque complex so that you can walk between the two in air-conditioned safety, because people were actually dying of sunstroke and things. Again, this is part of the modern reworking of the ritual. This is the path between the two mountains that you're supposed to walk. One of the rituals we mentioned was the stoning of the devil. The first time you stone the middle pillar, the next time you stone all three. I'm almost certain this was an original ritual, probably part of the original pagan structure as well. And why? Well, what was the interpretation? Well, they're probably chasing away the evil jinn. It's part, you got to be clean, you got to be pure, and you got to chase away the evil spirits, so that then you can have this sacred experience at the Kaaba. You got to keep the evil spirits outside, and then the Kaaba inside. And so this is now reinterpreted as part of that restorationist theology as stoning the devil. And the reason for the three pillars, I don't know why they only do the middle pillar on the first one and three on the second one, but the story, the way the myth around the rituals, there's so much going on here, but there's a debate in scholarship whether ritual comes first or myth comes first. Do you tell a myth and then do you invent a ritual around the myth? Or did the ritual come first and then you invent a myth to explain the ritual? And this is a chicken and egg story that scholars debate ad nauseum. What we know here is that there is a myth that connects the ritual acts to the events and life of Muhammad, of Abraham. This is how Muhammad monotheizes the Kaaba in the temple there. And that is when Abraham went to sacrifice Ishmael, because he sacrifices Ishmael because the Muslims are descended of Ishmael, the Arabs are descending of Ishmael, and the Jews are descending from Isaac. So it's Ishmael that Abraham almost sacrifices. And when he goes to sacrifice Ishmael, he's taking him up the mountain, and Satan appears to him 3 times and tries to convince him not to do it. Hopefully that sounds familiar, like the 3 temptations of Jesus out in the wilderness. Well, here we have, out in the wilderness, away from the building, 3 pillars that you set up where you illustrate your willingness to fight the devil by not giving in to temptation. And so we have this myth of the sacrifice of Ishmael being tied to the ritual. The well of Zamzam has been there for a long time. It was there in the time of Muhammad. Islamic story says that it was dug by his grandfather, but it went all the way back to Abraham. And the way that works is that it was found by Abraham, or Ishmael, right, as he kicked the ground. It was originally found by him, and then had been lost and destroyed. And God guided Abraham's grandfather, I believe it was, to the spot and told him to dig. And Muhammad's grandfather was guided to the spot and told by God to dig there, and he dug and found the well. And therefore all of the wealth of Mecca came from Muhammad's grandfather. This is this great story, and it connects it to Muhammad, to Muhammad's family, and all the way back to Abraham. And then it was lost and restored. Again, that restorationist theology. Water from the well is given out to all the pilgrims. There's no way for all the pilgrims to go to the well. And so instead, water is pumped from the well underneath and brought to a purification plant to remove bacteria so you don't get sick after drinking it. And then the water is bottled, and you get an idea of how much that is, right, into these massive bottle, this room. There's a video Saudi Arabia puts out about all the work they do to pump the water and bring the water and bottle the water. And I took this picture from their video, and you don't. It's bigger than this. You got to see it move, where it points down and slowly points up to just get a view of how big this room full of bottled water from this well is. And it's impressive that the well can continue to support that many people. I'm going to end with this story from the life of Malcolm X. And if you recall, Malcolm X began in the nonviolent movement with Martin Luther King. And eventually he concluded that there was just no hope. He lost faith that we could create a racially blind or a beloved community where people of all races are welcomed together. And he gave up on that concept and began what we call the Black Power movement, which is this idea that if we can't live in harmony, solving race and working together in a beloved community together, black people at least need power so that they can't be subjugated. And he joined this. There was a very non-Orthodox Islamic community that grew up in the Americas. Some of these slaves that were brought to America had been Muslim, but by disconnecting them from the rest of the Islamic world, the tradition changed and morphed, and there was this kind of non-Orthodox version of Islam that Malcolm X was converted to originally. And I hate to use the term racism because that's not quite fair, right? Minorities, racism is something a majority does to a minority because the majority has power and it impacts the minority. But there was a concept of racial superiority inherent in this flavor of Islam, which is very antithetical to traditional Islam. And then Malcolm X, and that of course influenced Malcolm X's Black Power thinking. And I may be getting this history wrong, but this is my understanding. He then went on the Hajj, and it sort of converted him to more traditional Islam, and very much changed his view on many issues. And this was what he said about that experience. There were tens of thousands of pilgrims from all over the world. They were of all colors, from blue-eyed blondes to black-skinned Africans, but we were all participating in the same ritual, displaying a spirit of unity and brotherhood that my experience in America had led me to believe could never exist between the white and non-white races. Between the white and non-white. America needs to understand Islam because this is the one religion that erases from its society the race problem. You may be shocked by these words coming from me. He's expressing the fact that this is different from what he said in the past. But on this pilgrimage, what I have seen and experienced has forced me to rearrange much of my thought patterns previously held. So as we approach other religious traditions, I think it's important to leave room for sacred envy, holy envy. To find aspects that are beautiful that we can look at and say, I may not believe everything they do, but there's something they do that inspires me. And this is a very inspiring aspect of Islamic history and tradition that I think we can all look up to and find to be beautiful. If you're interested in some additional resources, there's a book on the Hajj, the Muslim pilgrimage, Mecca and the holy places, the Kaaba, orientations, readings from Islamic's ancient house. And then for general information on, and of course, the Wikipedia article, by the way, on the Hajj was pretty good. If you can parse it, it took me several times through it to make sense of it all. I used Stephen Prothero's God is Not One for that chart on the problem, the solution, and he has a chapter on Islam. It's very good. My class on Muhammad's life has this resource. The Life and Legacy of Muhammad is where I got most of that information from. And this lecture, of course, is part of a series on Islam. So if you're interested, you can go back and watch the introduction. You can watch the Life of Muhammad. I'll try to link those in the comments below, or not in the comments, in the video description below. And now we've done sacred rites and sacred spaces. And if we continue on Islam, I would love, these are potential future topics. I'd love to actually read through the Quran and take some selected readings and discuss them. I'd love to cover later Islamic history through the Crusades and the colonialization and the way colonialization impacted our conflict with Islam today. And things like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict are shaped by that history of colonialization. We also haven't even mentioned Sufi and the mystical traditions of Islam, which is a shame because those are my favorite form of Islam. I have very much sacred envy for the Sufi concepts of what God is and how we approach God. And then I know I'm going to do a lecture, at least one, on Islam and modern challenges, where we talk about jihad and the political problems of Islamophobia in the US, and in contrast, Islamism elsewhere, which is an attempt to impose variations of Islam on other people by force. which we see in situations like Al-Qaeda, et cetera. So we need to talk about that at some point. And again, if we can find someone who's interested, I'd love to have a believer then come and give their perspective on what we shared. All right, any final questions, thoughts, and insights that you want to share before we go? If not, I hope that the things we have shared today help you on your life's journey, and I hope to see you next time. Bye.